Have you noticed that some seasons of life seem to arrive without warning? The conversations change, the priorities shift, and somewhere along the way, the person you were yesterday no longer feels like the person you're becoming. You didn't plan it, you didn't schedule it on a calendar, but something inside you started to move. Maybe it was a conversation that stayed with you longer than it should have. Maybe it was a quiet Tuesday morning when, for no clear reason, you felt an ache for something different, something simpler, something more honest. Many spiritual traditions suggest that certain moments in time invite us to pause, to reflect, to choose quietly and deliberately a new direction. For many people, August 3rd feels like one of those moments. Not because anything magical is promised, not because the universe owes you a miracle, but because some dates, for reasons we can't always explain, seem to arrive carrying a kind of stillness, a kind of invitation. If you're watching this, maybe you already feel it. A subtle pull, a sense that something in you is ready to shift, even if you can't yet name what it is. Stay with this story for the next few minutes, not because it will hand you certainty, but because it might help you understand a feeling you've been carrying, quietly, for longer than you realized. This is a story about turning points, about the courage it takes to notice one, and about what many believe becomes possible when we do. Let's begin. Throughout history, people from very different cultures have paused at certain moments to reflect on where they've been and where they're going. Some traditions have marked the turning of seasons with quiet ceremonies of release, letting go of what no longer serves and welcoming what comes next. Others have treated the changing of light, the shifting of a calendar page, or the arrival of a new month as a natural invitation to look inward. This isn't about superstition, it's about rhythm. Human beings have always searched for markers, small, meaningful checkpoints that help us measure growth. A birthday, a new year, the first day of a new season. These moments don't create transformation on their own, but according to many spiritual traditions, they can act like doors. Quiet reminders that life is not static and that we always have the option to begin again. Some people interpret August, specifically, as a month of transition. It sits at the edge between the fullness of summer and the slower turn toward autumn. It's a season of harvest in many parts of the world, a time when what was planted earlier in the year begins to show its results. Whether or not you follow any particular spiritual path, there's something universally relatable in that image. We plant seeds, habits, intentions, hopes, often without knowing exactly how they'll grow, and every so often, life gives us a pause long enough to notice what's actually taken root. August 3rd isn't a date with any official spiritual authority behind it. No ancient text singles it out. But many people who follow astrology, numerology, or personal reflection practices have come to see early August as a symbolic threshold, a moment that invites clarity before the second half of the year unfolds. It's less about the date itself and more about what the date represents. A permission slip to stop, breathe, and ask yourself an honest question. What have I been carrying that I no longer need to carry? That question alone is enough to shift something, not because of mysticism, but because most of us rarely give ourselves permission to ask it. Before any visible change happens in a person's life, something quieter tends to happen first. It doesn't look like anything dramatic. There's no clear before and after photo. It usually starts as a feeling, a subtle discomfort with something that used to feel fine. Maybe a routine that once felt comfortable now feels a little hollow. Maybe a relationship that used to bring energy now leaves you feeling drained. Maybe your ambitions, the ones you used to chase without question, suddenly feel like they belong to someone else. This is what many describe as the hidden shift, the internal movement that happens long before anyone else can see it. Psychologically, This kind of restlessness often shows up during periods of growth. When we outgrow old patterns, our minds and emotions tend to signal it, not with clarity, but with tension. A sense that something doesn't fit anymore, even if we can't explain why. Spiritually, many traditions describe this as an awakening, not in a dramatic lightning bolt sense, but as a slow unfolding. Like a plant pushing gently against soil it has finally outgrown. You may have felt this before without naming it. A quiet dissatisfaction that isn't sadness exactly, more like an ache for something more aligned. A sense that you're being nudged, gently but persistently, toward change. The important thing to understand is this. That discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong with you. According to many who study personal growth, spiritually and psychologically, that discomfort is often the first sign that something right is beginning. Growth rarely feels graceful in the moment. It usually feels like confusion first, like uncertainty, like standing at the edge of something you can sense but not yet see clearly. And that uncertainty, as uncomfortable as it is often exactly where change begins. If you've been feeling this quiet shift, you're not alone. Many people describe similar experiences during seasons of personal transformation. Here are 7 signs that many associate with this kind of inner change, not as guarantees, but as possibilities worth reflecting on. Sign 1. You feel called to slow down and reflect. There's a difference between being tired and being called to stillness. Tiredness wants rest. This feeling wants presence. You might notice yourself wanting fewer plans, fewer obligations, fewer distractions. Not because you're giving up on life, but because some part of you is asking for space to actually feel your life instead of rushing through it. Many spiritual traditions view this pull towards stillness as an important signal, not a warning, but an invitation. A sign that your inner world is asking for attention it hasn't received in a while. This one can be uncomfortable to admit. A friendship that once felt easy now feels effortful. A daily habit that used to bring comfort now feels like something you're doing out of obligation rather than joy. This doesn't mean every relationship or habit needs to end, but many describe this feeling as a quiet signal to reassess, to ask honestly whether something still fits who you're becoming or whether it belonged to who you used to be. Maybe a friend mentions the exact idea you'd been quietly thinking about. Maybe you keep encountering the same message in a conversation, a song, a passing thought, at moments when you needed to hear it most. Some call this synchronicity. Others simply call it heightened awareness. The idea that when we slow down and pay closer attention, we naturally start noticing patterns we would have otherwise missed. Whichever explanation resonates with you, many describe these small coincidences as gentle nudges. Not proof of anything supernatural necessarily, but reminders to keep paying attention. There's a particular kind of relief that comes when something that used to terrify you suddenly feels smaller. A fear of failure that once held you back, a fear of judgment that once kept you quiet. This shift often doesn't happen because the fear disappeared entirely. It happens because your relationship to the fear changed. You began to trust yourself a little more than you trust the fear. Many describe this as one of the clearest markers of inner growth, not the absence of fear, but the quiet decision to move forward anyway. If you've spent years chasing achievement, recognition, or approval, this shift can feel almost unfamiliar. A pull toward peace instead of constant productivity. A desire for quiet mornings instead of packed schedules. This isn't laziness. It's often described as a recalibration, a return to a slower, more intentional pace after a long stretch of urgency. What once felt essential, a title, a possession, a certain image, may start to feel less important. Meanwhile, things you once overlooked, time with people you love, honest conversations, small daily moments of gratitude, begin to feel like what actually matters. This shift in priorities rarely happens all at once. It tends to happen gradually, almost without your noticing, until one day you realize your definition of a good life has quietly changed. This is the hardest one to describe because it isn't based on logic. It's simply a feeling, a quiet certainty that something new is on its way, even without evidence to point to. Many describe this as intuition. Others describe it as faith. Whatever word resonates with you, this feeling often arrives not as a dramatic revelation, but as a soft, steady knowing that sits quietly in the background of your days. If even one of these signs resonated with you, take a moment to sit with that. You don't need to act on it immediately. You don't need to have it all figured out. Awareness on its own is often the first and most important step. Which of these 7 signs do you relate to most? Take a moment, and if you feel comfortable, share it in the comments below. Sometimes naming what we're feeling, out loud or even just to a stranger on the internet, makes it a little more real. Here's something rarely talked about honestly. Growth is often preceded by fear, not confidence. Before most meaningful changes in a person's life, there's usually a stretch of uncertainty. A period where the old way of living no longer fits, but the new way hasn't fully arrived yet. It's uncomfortable. It can even feel like something is going wrong. But many who study both psychology and spirituality describe this discomfort differently, not as a sign of failure, but as a natural part of transformation. Think of it this way. A caterpillar doesn't simply wake up one day as a butterfly. It goes through a stage that looks from the outside like stillness, even collapse. Inside the chrysalis, the old structure breaks down almost completely before anything new can take shape. If you've been feeling uncertain lately, unsure of your direction, unsure of your next step, that uncertainty doesn't necessarily mean something is broken. It might mean you're in the middle of your own quiet transformation, the kind that doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but instead asks for patience. Fear, in this context, isn't your enemy. It's often simply your mind's way of protecting you from unfamiliar territory. The problem isn't that fear exists. It's when we let fear make our decisions for us. Many spiritual traditions describe courage not as the absence of fear, but as the willingness to act with fear present. To take one honest step forward, even while uncertain. To trust that clarity often comes not before action, but because of it. If August 3rd feels significant to you, it may be less about what the date guarantees and more about what it represents. Permission to move forward despite uncertainty. Permission to take one small, honest step. Not because you know exactly where it leads, but because staying still no longer feels like an option. So, if you're standing at this kind of quiet threshold, what actually helps? Not grand gestures, not overnight reinvention. According to many who've walked through meaningful personal change, the most powerful shifts tend to come from small, consistent choices. Gratitude is often the first place people begin, not as a forced positivity, but as an honest practice of noticing what's already good, even in the middle of uncertainty. Some people write down 3 things they're grateful for each morning. Others simply pause before sleep to reflect on one moment from the day that mattered. Over time, this practice tends to shift attention away from what's lacking and toward what's already present. Forgiveness is another practice many describe as essential. Not necessarily forgiving others, though that matters too, but forgiving yourself. For decisions you wish you'd made differently. For chapters of your life you're not proud of. For time you feel you've lost. Holding on to old guilt is a bit like carrying stones in a backpack you no longer need. Many spiritual traditions describe forgiveness not as forgetting, but as finally setting the weight down. Intentional living is the third piece, the practice of making choices deliberately instead of on autopilot. This might mean setting a clear intention each morning. It might mean choosing consciously how you want to show up in a difficult conversation. It might simply mean pausing before reacting and asking yourself, does this choice reflect who I'm becoming or who I used to be? None of these practices promise instant transformation. There's no guarantee that gratitude will erase hardship, or that forgiveness will undo the past, or that intention alone will change your circumstances overnight. But many who've walked this path describe something quieter and, in some ways, more powerful. A growing sense of alignment. A feeling that your daily choices are finally starting to match the person you want to become. That alignment, more than any single date on a calendar, tends to be what actually creates lasting change. August 3rd can be a meaningful starting point, a symbolic line in the sand. But the traditions that value it also tend to agree on one thing. The moment matters less than what you choose to do after it. If you're looking for somewhere to begin, consider this. Choose one thing, just one, that you've been meaning to release. An old grudge, a habit that no longer serves you, a fear that's been quietly running your decisions. And choose one thing you've been meaning to welcome. A new boundary, a kinder inner voice, a little more stillness in your days. You don't need August 3rd to make this decision. But if the date gives you the nudge you've been waiting for, many would say that's reason enough to take it seriously. Transformation rarely looks like the moment it happened. It usually looks, in hindsight, like a series of small decisions that quietly built toward something larger. The morning you decided to forgive someone, even though it was hard. The day you set a boundary you'd been avoiding for years. The quiet evening you sat with your own thoughts instead of reaching for a distraction. None of these moments feel dramatic while they're happening. But many who look back on their own personal growth describe these small choices as the true turning points, far more than any single date ever could be. So if August 3rd feels meaningful to you, let it be that. A meaningful moment, a reminder, not a guarantee. An invitation to pause and ask yourself an honest question, rather than a promise that anything extraordinary is required to happen. You don't need certainty to begin. You don't need to have every answer before you take the next step. What you need, more than anything, is the willingness to keep choosing, gently, honestly, one day at a time. Meaningful transformation, according to nearly every tradition that has studied it, doesn't usually arrive as a single moment of magic. It arrives through consistency, through self-awareness, through resilience, practiced quietly, again and again, especially on the days when it feels hardest. Wherever you are in your own journey, whether you feel that quiet shift already moving through you, or you're simply curious about what it might mean, know this. You don't need permission to begin again. You never did. But if you've been waiting for a sign, a moment, a reason to finally take that first honest step forward, perhaps this is it. Not because August 3rd guarantees anything, but because you, right now, are ready to choose. If this story spoke to something in you, consider subscribing for more thoughtful reflections like this one. Not for promises of miracles, but for honest, grounded stories about growth, awareness, and the quiet courage it takes to keep choosing yourself. Because in the end, the most meaningful transformations rarely begin with the universe. They begin with you.